X4 Timelines takes the X series in a very different direction. Now, keep in mind that at this point, this series is very old, it's a few decades old, came out in the late 90s, and that means there's a lot of long-term fans of this franchise. And they may have certain expectations of what they see, what they hope to see when it comes to the many expansions that have released over the years. All of them tend to release extensions to the galaxy, as well as new alien races and maybe a few new ships. X4 Timelines then is completely different. Whilst it does have a little bit of that, the main focus is instead on little storylines, little snippets and additional missions. All of these are played sequentially. It's a complete change for the whole game then, it's a complete change for the series, and I'm not 100% sure whether everyone is going to like it. It may turn out that this is something that, well, is a little bit divisive. So there's definitely a lot of good sides to this and a few not so good as well, and we'll talk about both of those or all of those. Unlike previous X4 expansions, this doesn't dramatically expand the game itself. Instead, it's essentially an entirely different mode, and one you can play through in a linear fashion. So, with all that said, do be aware that this is not a review, not in any way whatsoever. Instead, it's just my impressions of the early hours of the update itself. And also, just so you're aware, full transparency here, the preview build did come with an embargo as well, so there's a few things that I can't talk about. The embargo, at least part of it, ended at 3 PM today UK time, which means I can release pre-recorded videos, but there's a few parts of the story, a few parts of the later missions that I'm not allowed to talk about just yet, and all of that, I do believe, as far as I can tell at least, is due to Egosoft wanting to avoid spoilers. So yeah, there's some pretty big events that come later down the line. So just so everyone is aware of what exactly X4 is, this is a single-player sandbox game. It's set in a massive universe where you build your own empire. You start out with a single ship and a few credits, maybe a few thousand credits, and you build up your own complete empire. You can do this usually through trading, but you can do it through other activities as well, such as mining, combat, and other such things. Over time, you'll build other ships that you can use, and yes, you can have a whole fleet of ships, and some of these can be very large capital-sized ships as well. You can also construct and own your own space stations, multiple space stations in fact, and all of these plug into the ongoing simulated economy. That's right, the game does have a full economy that's simulated right across the entire galaxy. When it comes to space games then, there's nothing else out there that's quite like the X series. X4 Timelines then does diverge somewhat away from that thanks to its heavy focus on these little missions, and I say they're all little, but the time you actually play them will certainly vary. Each mission is very different, but the main point is that these missions are not part of the sandbox world. They're something entirely different, they're very separate from that. So to be perfectly clear at this point, I haven't played dozens or hundreds of hours of X4 Timelines, I've just played a few hours to get a bit of a feel of what the game is all about. So the final thing, the final key piece of information that you need to know is how does this all work? Well, X4 Timelines starts out with you playing a named character, and you start out in what seemed to be a cutscene involved in some combat, and it seems that the main character is just about to die right at that last moment, right at the key moment, at the moment that your ship is about to explode, something extraordinary happens. Yes, this is spoilers, so do be aware before you go on. If you don't want any spoilers, I urge you to stop watching now. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So there we have it. If you're still here, I assume that you want to know everything about this. So right at the moment you're about to die, time freezes, and a key character appears, offering to pluck you out of the timeline and take you away from there to a moment, well, a moment in time where you're not dead. They make it clear to you that you'll never be able to return back to your own time or your old life. Instead, you've got a new mission, something that you're going to have to follow. They take you to an area called the Facility, and from there you can dive into historical periods throughout the X franchise timeline. Now it seems that all this is done not through a true method of time travel, but rather through some sort of virtual reality, a system whereby you get hooked up into a machine and projected into the past. Now, the missions from this point are all linear. You have to follow one through from the other, and they all take place in the form of chapters. Each chapter is divided into a different number of missions. You have to complete all the missions to complete the chapter, and then you're about to move on to the next chapter. The good thing about all of this then is that it breaks X4 down into smaller, easily to digest components, and Anyone who's played X4 before, or indeed any of the other X games, will know that this franchise is known for being extremely complex and it's very heavy. It also doesn't have much in the way of tutorials, so it can be very difficult to get into. The idea then of breaking this down into easily to digest parts is a very compelling one, and yes, it's something that for the most part does actually work. And yes, X4 I do personally believe needs very much in the way of tutorials and a bit more hand-holding. It's a very complex game, and I've always found it a little bit troubling to get into. So what about these missions? Well, the first one is some racing. You race around a big asteroid-filled racetrack of some type, and there's no context for why you're here, there's no reason for you to be racing, and what's more, there's no apparent reward for doing so. And this really brings me to the main problem I have with the X4 Timelines expansion as a whole. It really doesn't have a compelling reason for you to actually want to actually care. Now, I fully understand that if you're a fan of the series, then there's a good chance you're going to like some of these missions because they do take place in the key moments of the past. So if you know all about the game's lore and the game's history, you're going to get to take place directly in key moments of that lore. And well, I guess like any franchise, if you can do that with Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or any other such story, you could revisit moments of the past and watch them or directly participate in them, then that's something that you're going to very much enjoy. And I'm sure the same is true for people who are fans of the X lore, the X franchise. For me though, whilst I do like the X games very much so, I'm not a big fan when it comes to X lore. So jumping in and playing these key moments from the past doesn't really offer me anything other than gameplay itself. And the gameplay itself feels a little bit, well, how do we put it? Flat? I don't know how else to say it. It just feels as though, for me at least, there's no compelling reason to actually complete some of these missions. For example, at the racetrack mission I just mentioned. Now, before X4 Timelines released, the Egosoft did mention that aside from the fact that these are key moments from the past, these missions would also serve as tutorials. And that got me very much excited. I was keen to see how this would work out, whether or not it would actually introduce the game to a broader audience. Well, here's a problem. Whilst they can theoretically act as tutorials, when it comes down to practice, they don't, because, quite simply put, the game doesn't give you any instructions on how to play the missions. So, if you've never played X4 before and you jump into this racing mission, for example, you'll have no idea on how to fly the ship, how to pilot it, or even how to race. The mission simply gives you no instructions for that. And then you come to the second mission, which is an escort mission, and this, well, obviously requires some combat experience. And again, the mission gives you no instructions on how to do that. So for me, X4 Timelines feels like an expansion that is very much at odds with itself. On the one hand, it's got these missions that are, well, easy to digest, they're short and they're self-contained, and what's more, for fans of the X lore, they're likely very rewarding. But on the other hand, they give you no real guidance, no real tutorial, no real understanding on how to complete them. And if you're not a fan of the lore, then, well, there's also, unfortunately, no real reason to get invested. There's nothing in there that acts as a hook. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself if the story or the writing can carry the game for you. Unfortunately, though, here again, it's another area where it's very, very weak. Egosoft generally, at least in my opinion, are not the best when it comes to writing. In fact, for me, I found some of this to be a little bit on the cringy side and actually found it quite difficult to stick with it or actually listen to the dialogue. There's cliches everywhere. But that's not something that's unusual to the X series. Indeed, it's a part of the charm. But what carries a game usually, historically, is its compelling universe. The fact that you take part in a massive sandbox universe, the fact you can build your own empire, all of those are the key focus of what makes the X franchise so compelling. And unfortunately, the X4 Timelines mission takes that very key aspect away, leaving you instead with what, in my opinion, are some of the least effective components of the X series. Unfortunately then, I really do feel that X4 Timelines is very much a mixed bag. But do keep in mind that this is not a review. I don't tend to review games anyway, but this is just my initial impression based upon the first few hours of the game. It's kind of like a preview, I guess, even though not really a preview, just sort of my feelings and impressions. Ultimately, I saw nothing in X4 Timelines that really compelled me to want to play more. I know that may feel like I'm shitting on the game a bit too hard, and that's not really the way I want to come across, because like I said, there are some aspects in here that I feel a lot of people are likely going to enjoy, especially if you're long-term fans of the series, diving into the past, taking part in these massive events. And don't get me wrong, as you get further into this game, we're looking at the chapters ahead, there are some very, very strong and big narrative moments that are about to appear. And some of these I can't talk about because they are under embargo, but suffice to say, they're moments that will dramatically shake up the X universe, and for any long-term fans of the game, you're likely going to very much enjoy that. Ultimately then, I think whether or not you enjoy X4 Timelines will depend upon how you play the X4 game itself and how you feel about the X4 or the X franchise overall. If, like me, your entire focus on playing X is all about the sandbox universe, then these self-contained missions may not have too much to offer you. And whilst there are other components that are outside of this as some extra content, it may not be enough to warrant getting hold of the entire expansion. If, on the other hand, you love the style of writing and the type of story that X offers, and you're really a big fan of the X franchise, then definitely you're going to be enjoying X4 Timelines. Ultimately, I do have a lot of respect for Egosoft. They kept the space game genre going during the dark ages when there was no other space games out there, and for that I'll always be huge fans of them. Additionally, they have a single-player sandbox universe unlike any other. It really is that good. And at the end of the day, regardless of how I feel about X4 Timelines personally, I do think this is a bold direction for Egosoft to head in. They're not frightened of trying something new, and in that regard, this is a very good attempt at expanding what the X4 game is all about. X4 Timelines then will be available on the 20th of June. Do check out the links in the video description for all the extra information you need to know. Take care, and thanks for watching this video all the way to the end.